Okay, well, good morning, everyone. Day 3 of Delta. I hope you enjoyed the day off and managed to see the sights. It wasn't as warm yesterday, but today's a stinker. And thankfully, they fixed the air conditioning in here. So we are all good. So we're starting off online, heading over to our American colleagues this morning. The first 3 talks are online. So I'm delighted to introduce Rachel, and I can see some of her co-presenters or co-authors online as well. This is one of the IGMES special edition papers. And so, Rachel, over to you. Welcome to Delta.
Great. Thank you for the introduction. Wish we could be there in person. So thank you everybody for coming to our talk. We will be presenting upon our paper about post-secondary math instructors' characterizations of equitable and inclusive teaching. So to start, I want to highlight a recent review of equity studies published between 2000 and 2022, which revealed that equity in post-secondary or tertiary math education is understudied, at least in the context of the United States. Further, many equity-focused studies do not provide a definition of equity, and when those definitions are provided, they vary widely. So what this suggests as a research community is that we've not developed a shared understanding of what equity looks like in the post-secondary mathematics space. Likewise, we don't know enough about how practitioners, so that is how mathematics instructors are thinking about equity and inclusion in their own teaching in their classrooms. So this was ultimately the purpose of our investigation was we wanted to know more about how mathematics post-secondary instructors are defining equity and inclusion in the context of mathematics teaching. So before we get into the details about our specific study, I wanted to talk about different conceptions of equity and inclusion in mathematics that do exist that are cited widely. So in 2002, Gutierrez defined equity in math as the inability to predict math achievement and participation based solely on student characteristics such as race, class, ethnicity, gender, proficiency in the dominant language, etc. She expanded upon this definition to provide a framing of equity that we've used in our research. In this framing of equity, she introduces 2 different axes in 4 dimensions. So the dominant axis reflects how equity is typically described in mathematics education studies, and it has 2 associated dimensions. So one of the dimensions is access to resources and opportunities to learn mathematics that's valued by the dominant culture. The second dimension is achievement of student outcomes that are desired by the dominant culture or dominant society. And then the second axis, which is less focused upon in equity studies, is the critical axis. And there are 2 dimensions associated with this axis, identity and power. So identity refers to opportunities that students have to bring their whole selves into the mathematical experience. So this includes math curriculum that reflects students' various identities, as well as gives students opportunities to engage with each other's identities. The power dimension refers to how mathematics participation can or does not equip students to critique and transform the world around them, specifically to disrupt traditional power hierarchies. So inclusion as a construct overlaps with equity. Inclusive teaching encompasses a range of practices, but broadly refers to practices that position students as co-creators in their learning, that foster caring and trusting relationships between instructors and students. Inclusive teaching embraces the cultural, social, political, and emotional identities students bring to the classroom. Often in studies of inclusion in mathematics, inclusive teaching is contrasted with exclusionary teaching practices. And I'm going to go a little bit into the data now that we collected for this study and what the focus of our study was. So in this study, we analyzed interview data from 13 math faculty at various stages in their career, all taught at post-secondary institutions in the United States. Each instructor participated in a year-long equity workshop, which was developed by a subset of a team from something called the Seminole Project, which was focused on active learning in mathematics lower division courses in the post-secondary space. As part of this equity workshop, participants completed interviews in September 2020 and May 2021. You can see here in this table a snapshot of some of the participant demographics. So we had 4 women of color, 4 white women, 2 men of color, and 3 white men who were interviewed, and whose data we drew upon for these analyses. So I'm actually going to turn it over to my co-author, Karina, now, who will talk a little bit more about what exactly we did and some of our results.
Great. Thank you, Rachel. So for our first research question, we focused on what characteristics arise when mathematics faculty members are asked to define equitable inclusive teaching. So for our research methods, really we wanted to do an open coding process. We wanted to just see what our participants were saying when we asked them to define equitable and inclusive teaching. And as Rachel mentioned, our data that we analyzed came from both pre and post interviews from our participants. And we went through an iterative inductive coding process to generate an initial codebook of categories that defined EIT. And all of our authors coded independently. Then we met to reconcile and refine the categories as we went along for all of our data. So we came up with 2 themes that described how our participants were characterizing EIT. And I'll go into each of these themes a little bit more in detail. Our first theme was awareness and consideration of students. So this is when instructors were describing their students' backgrounds, lived experiences, and how that impacted their identity and capacity to do mathematics. And then also student engagement. And this is when our participants described how students were engaging in the classroom, in the mathematical community, and then also their agency in the classroom. So for our first theme, awareness and consideration of students, we had 3 subcodes here: background and learning experiences, access to material resources, and social emotional considerations. And these are the definitions from our code book, and then short quotes for each of these. So background and learning experiences or when instructors mention students' prior background and learning experiences with mathematics, talking about meeting them where they are. For access to material resources, this is when instructors mention things like students' financial access or access to resources, or talking about how some students can't attend office hours due to maybe family commitments or job. And then finally, social emotional considerations, where instructors mention student feelings or their emotional health and social belonging. So here, talking about when students should feel safe and the feelings going along with that. And so here is the subcode background and learning experiences. You can see that all 13 of our participants mentioned something relating to this subcode. And this is a longer quote from Mark. Mark stated that equity is more about a recognition that students come in with different levels of preparation, so talking about their mathematical backgrounds, and I need to try hard to meet them in different ways. So again, attending to their prior learning experiences and background. For our second subcode under this first theme, the access to material resources, we had 6 participants who mentioned something like this. And here, an example quote from Cassandra saying, making sure that everyone has access to the same resources, or if necessary, pointing people in other directions for other resources. So not equal resources. So making sure that people have access to the resources that they need, and realizing that the material resources that they need might be different according to their different needs. And then finally, the social emotional considerations. All but 2 of our participants mentioned something about this. And here, this quote from Thomas talks about how, I think being equitable and inclusive means how your students really connect with you as a person and feel like they can talk to you. Treating them as human beings and making sure they feel cared about. So that's relating to students' socio-emotional well-being and health. So for our second big theme, student engagement, under this, how our participants were defining EIT, we had two subcodes here. So participation, dealing with participation mainly in the classroom, and then also ownership and investment. So participation, an example quote, students should engage with content and peers. And then for the ownership and investment, this is when instructors described student ownership of their learning, and this is more specific than our general participation code. So students should feel like the material is for them. So for participation, all but one of our participants mentioned something about students participating and how that was part of equitable and inclusive teaching. Here, Camila says one aspect is recognizing that everybody that's in the room, like the people who are marginalized, I want to be able to recognize and give them a chance to participate and have them feel valued and seen. So again, talking about that participation in the classroom. And then for our second subcode, this ownership and investment, only 5 out of our 13 participants mentioned something like this. But again, this was more specific than that general participation code. And here Emma is talking about having an approach to teaching that makes it clear to students that math is something they create and they take ownership of, and less like this is something being handed down to them from the authorities. So again, that ownership and investment in their own learning. And then this is just an overview of those participants who mentioned each of these subcodes under our two big themes. And then I think Molly is going to take over and discuss our second research question.
Yeah. So during the first round of coding, our team realized that we were not capturing some nuance in responses. Specifically, we thought there were some important ideas and common language that were being used that were not necessarily topics or characteristics of EIT, but that it was something that we wanted or needed to capture. And so this led us to define a second research question about how did instructors respond when asked to define EIT. So we conducted a second inductive cycle of coding that focused on this, how participants were responding, like being reflective or describing what EIT was not, which ultimately led us to refine our code book by redefining our already category of reflective practice and then creating a new category which we called reifying EIT. So these ended up being our overall themes for research question 2. And so reflective practice was moments where instructors were sort of generally reflecting on their pedagogical teaching in the classroom. And then reifying EIT reification was a concept that we took from Wenger, who described it as the reflective process where people produce concrete meanings from abstract ideas. And so for us, this category became where moments where instructors were trying to engage with the definition of equity and inclusion by attempting to parse it out in a more concrete way. So in our first category, reflective practice, we had 2 sub-themes. The first one was self-reflection. And this was when sort of a more general category when instructors were generally reflecting on their teaching practices or even their personal biases, or even like what instructors what instructors should believe or do in the classroom. Whereas the second sub-theme, actions, was reserved for when instructors were identifying more specific teacher actions that they thought connected to EIT. So as you can see, all 13 participants had some kind of self-reflection of their teaching practices in their response. And Adaya's quote is a really nice reflection of this. And Adaya said, I had all these preconceived notions of this is how all students are. And I have to understand that no, not everybody's like you. And that I need to accept that, understand that, and mold my teaching practices to, help those students. And then for actions, you can see that not everyone had specific actions, but a lot of them gave specific actions a lot of them gave specific teaching actions that they thought connected to EIT. So, for example, some of them talked about maybe speaking the student's heritage language, or trying to pronounce names correctly, or intentionally asking identity-related questions, or even making sure that the grading system aligns in a way that shows student growth. For the second overall category, for research question 2 was reifying EIT. There was 3 sub-themes that came up. The first one was more EIT. This was when instructors described what EIT should be more of, like being more vulnerable. And the second category was not EIT. This is when instructors defined EIT in terms of what it was not, like not being insulted when students communicate with me in a way that is not academic. And then the third sub-theme was uncertainty in EIT. And this is when instructors were expressing some kind of uncertainty in how to define EIT or how to apply it. Um, so for the more EIT, we had 6 out of the 13 participants use this idea of more in their response. And so Bill is a good example of this. And Bill says, I think now maybe it's evolved to the place where I need to be more purposeful and vocal about these issues to the entire class. Whereas not EIT, you can see that 8 out of the 13 participants used this idea of what EIT was not. And so some of the things participants said that EIT was not was like not leaving students out of the classroom experiences, or not allowing one student or group to dominate the discussion, or not restricting learning to just lecture, or not requiring students to use academic language, or being insulted if they ended up using it poorly. So finally, 6 out of the 13 participants expressed some kind of uncertainty in defining EIT. And so you can see from Thomas, Thomas says, I don't feel like I've given a good definition or the definition at all of inclusivity or equitability, but that it's a beginning. And so we really appreciated capturing this kind of uncertainty in the responses. And so I will end with the next slide, which is a kind of a quick snapshot of how all 13 participants responded with this reflective practice in reifying EIT. And you can see quickly that like everyone was fairly reflective in their responses. And then another interesting thing to note is that at least most of the participants, I think 10 out of the 13 or 11 out of the 13, used some kind of more or not, or even both in their responses. And I'll hand it back over to Rachel to wrap us up.
Yeah, thanks, Molly. So our findings show that instructors' conceptualizations of EIT align with some themes or dimensions that are commonly described in education research. So, for example, we saw strong connections between instructor definitions and dimensions of identity, access, and achievement. Some instructor definitions also touched upon like power dynamics and ways to, or they expressed a desire to disrupt power imbalances in education, though very few emphasized power strongly in their definitions. There was also a significant emphasis on the role that instructors are playing, which I think makes sense because they were asked to define equitable and inclusive teaching. So several focused on specific actions in the classroom that they associate with EIT. Our results further suggest that instructors, so some instructors struggled to articulate definitions of equitable and inclusive teaching, but they made sense of it by reflecting on their own practice and by questioning dominant practices or identifying exclusionary teaching practices. So instructors frequently described EIT by contrasting it with what it was not. And this is actually very similar to findings in the literature of how equity and inclusion are studied. So Roost in a 2019 literature review of how inclusion is studied in mathematics education found that there was a common discourse of describing inclusion in relation to exclusion. So focusing on exclusionary practices to study inclusion. Similarly, Beck et al. Found that the studies that, even though there were very few studies in the post-secondary space in the United States, those studies that were present in their literature review mainly focused on identifying inequities as a way to study equity in mathematics education. So for some final conclusions, so this study contributed to our understanding of how instructors make sense of new teaching practices, specifically equitable and inclusive teaching practices in mathematics. The study was based in the US, so we would be interested in exploring conceptions of EIT in different contexts. Um, Further, future studies could examine like the connection between definitions and the concrete instructional practices that instructors use in their classroom, specifically in support of finding ways in which we could foster a more like critical stance in both practice and conceptualization of EIT. Um, so that is the conclusion of our main presentation. Thank you. I do want to go to our acknowledgement slide to acknowledge all of the folks who ran the equity PD workshop and who collected the data, um, as well as those that helped us in initial data collection. And now, time for questions, I think.
Great. Thanks very much, Rachel and Molly. Thanks very much, Rachel and Molly. Questions? There's one online. Hopefully you can see that from Kerry. How much did you see that? Could you see that on the chat, Rachel? I'll read it out. How much growth did you see from instructors in the area of equity and inclusion? Were instructors deficit in this area part of the study, and how were they selected?
So the instructors in this study chose or they elected to be a part of this workshop. So the professional development team that developed this workshop did so as part of, so the Seminole project was focused on how to support mathematics courses to use active learning. So it didn't have like an explicit, at least at the start, focus on equity. And we found like in the course of analyzing different institutions who were part of this project that this was a need. And so the professional development team created a workshop, and folks who were part of that project who were interested in learning more about equity chose to participate in the workshop. The question about like growth is an interesting question. We did early in our analysis want to like consider the interviews, like their definitions in that like first interview, and we tried to do a comparison to the second interview, but we didn't see much that we could work from. That's not to say that they didn't grow in that area. It's just that the particular like methods we used and analysis we didn't show anything related to that. I don't know if Karina, Molly, you want to
I think
chime in at all.
yeah, I think we really wanted to, but measuring growth is hard, and we knew that we wanted more data to have a better story about their growth, and we didn't have that data. And so then we kind of wanted to not then think about the growth.
Well, and we focused explicitly just on responses to one question on the protocol as well. So we just focused on their responses to how they define equitable and inclusive teaching. Um,
I suppose the
so
reason
that,
bring it up is because it's very interesting, like to sit here like this. I like, well done, your work's great. I love it. I love it. I'm thinking about how we can replicate something similar and add to the pool to support. I mean, my issue, we sit there and we want people, like, it's like, how do we move people into the space? I suppose that's my biggest question and how we think about it. But even having your work on the table as starting points is great. So thank you.
Hussein's question there, Rachel, to what extent did your actions sub-theme align with active learning approaches?
yeah, that's a great question. Um, Molly or Karina, do you want or have thoughts? If not, all.
I feel like the participation subcode kind of spoke to that. A lot of the participants talked about having students engage in the class and participate and speak up. And so I think that was definitely influenced by their desire to use more active learning in their classroom. So I definitely think we saw that in our data, and I would say I think that's the place where we saw it the most is the participation. Molly and Rachel, do you have other?
Yeah. And then when they were describing like actions that they do like in their classroom or that they specifically associate with EIT, I mean, I think it goes into like how you define active learning in relation to equity. So we do have a prior study where we looked at how Seminole participants defined active learning. And from that study, we found that very few included equity in that definition. So that was something else too that like kind of prompted us to want to conduct this analysis is because we noticed that yeah, equity really wasn't something that um, folks were at least like including in their conceptualization when they were speaking with us. So um, I don't think that fully answers your question, but
You did in your conclusion slide when you said future work, because I kept thinking I would love a list of actions from this work. But I guess, yes, it's a future work. Yeah, thanks.
and we do have some that we've listed in the paper. Yeah, so like using students' heritage language, explicitly telling students they're welcome, like creation of classroom norms with students, um, like including topics of racism, or one person talked about like including environmental change topics in the classroom, etc. Um, yeah, using students' desired pronouns. There were others, but
Okay, well, Karina, Molly, and Rachel, thank you very much for a wonderful talk, and I'm sure you'll get people contacting you with regard to some more information and perhaps replicating the study or parts of the study overseas as well, which is what you're after. So thanks again.
thanks so much, everybody.